Hello and welcome to our short interview series on with housing and community advocates across the country. My name is Mike Loftin and I'm a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute and the CEO of Homewise. We're a New Mexico-based social enterprise that works very hard to increase access to home ownership, both so that people can have access to long-term affordable housing and to grow their wealth and help their families become more financially secure. Today, I'm with Representative Teresa Leger Fernández, our new Congresswoman, who has worked a lot and knows a lot about affordable housing, has been a really good advocate for affordable housing, as well as for lots of issues affecting northern New Mexico. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Hello, Mike Loftin, and everybody who's listening who cares about housing, because we should all care about the importance that affordable housing plays in the vitality of our communities. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thanks for being here. So, I mean, you've been an advocate for, way before you were a Congresswoman for affordable housing and for home ownership and, and been very involved in the broader community in New Mexico. And I'd love to hear more about because I know you've been working a lot on policy work and including stuff that addresses affordable housing and particularly increasing access to home ownership. Can you tell us more about your work as a Congresswoman on this front?
Yeah, I can. And I like the fact that you pointed out that I'd been working on these for a while. I helped put together the very first White House conference on housing. This was during Clinton. The idea that we weren't paying attention to housing before President Clinton is sad. But we also know that we are living through a moment now where home ownership is at sort of a very low, and especially for communities, on indigenous communities, Latinos, Hispanos, rural. Those communities are having a very difficult time finding affordable housing. It's not just an issue that affects people living in a place like Santa Fe where housing costs are so high. It's something I hear about everywhere I go in my district, whether I'm in Cuba or Clovis or Santa Fe or Farmington. This is an issue that we face across the country and across my district. I'm really pleased at what we have already done. In the American Rescue Plan, we brought over $40 billion in housing assistance to American families. A lot of this was in the form of the emergency rental assistance, but we also had emergency housing vouchers, homelessness assistance, and supportive services programs. And in terms of home ownership, we had the Homeowner Assistance Fund. Congress was really able to help families stay in their homes and keep the lights on with this critical funding. I'm also a very proud co-sponsor of the Housing is Infrastructure Act and the End Homelessness Act. So that the Housing is Infrastructure Act really recognized that housing is basic infrastructure. Community cannot thrive without home ownership, without our families being housed. And that would provide a major expansion of rental assistance of $70 billion to repair public housing and $45 billion in the National Housing Trust to build and preserve homes affordable to people who have the greatest needs. I also like the fact that it would include $2 billion to address urgent needs for tribal nations and $5 billion for my kind of district, $5 billion to preserve affordable homes in rural America.
Yeah, no, and it's like, what's really good is that the country did, and Congress and our leadership of America really did respond to the COVID pandemic and the crisis. And people, we kept a lot of people in their homes. So I really appreciate that work. And because we had to weather that storm. And now we have this big affordable housing crisis. It's like now we're looking, hopefully we're looking more proactively. What do we need to do in the future to build a firm foundation, right? So that people can prosper. So I know you have worked with other members of the House of Representatives on these issues. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about, your work on home ownership. And because, one thing we do know is when people own their own home, their housing cost is stable, right? The only part of your payment that goes up is taxes and insurance. If you're locked into a fixed rate mortgage, so long term, homeowners are way better off in terms of how affordable their housing is compared to renters, because 100% of renters' rent is subject to inflation. So tell us about like the homeownership, as you know, is very dear to Homewise. We really believe in it. It's a great way to build the middle class and help people get ahead. Tell us more about your work on promoting homeownership.
I will, because you said it, right? We all know, I think everybody listening today knows that homeownership is the primary driver of wealth creation for the majority of American families. It actually has a bigger impact in terms of building wealth than higher wages or access to higher education. But we see this huge gap between white Americans and Americans of color, Latinos, Indigenous, Black Americans, Asian Americans. It's larger than when the Fair Housing Act was first adopted in 1968. So one of the things we need to do is address that issue, right? How do we close the racial wealth gap? And one of the ways we do is by using home ownership targeted to those communities. So I actually really pushed for the idea of a home ownership voucher program, because we know that when you need that money isn't as a tax credit in April, you need that money when you're closing on the home. Right. And so that's why I want to make sure that we get money out to people when they are sitting at the title office, ready to sign on the dotted line. That's when they need the money. And thank you, Homewise. But I actually took an idea that Homewise had of creating homeownership vouchers. And I was able to include some funding in the minibus. We call it the minibus. There was a package of 6 government funding bills that we passed out of the House last week. And one of them includes my request for about $750,000 for homeownership vouchers. These are going to be run through Homewise. And I really see this as a pilot project so that we can then scale up. After you do a great job, I'm counting on you, Mike. You got to deliver for us, because the rest of the country is watching. And I also got another sum of money, another pot of money, so that I could have health center workforce housing in Cuba, New Mexico. There's a great clinic there. It is amazing, but there's no housing available for the medical staff. And this idea of workforce housing is important. And so that's why I want to see us work on affordable housing through Homewise. And I know in some ways you work across New Mexico, but you really do focus on some of our urban areas or suburban areas. So, this way we're looking at what can we do in those urban areas with the homeownership vouchers, and then what can we do in my rural New Mexico with workforce housing. So I'm really happy about those 2 programs that I was able to get passed out of the House. It's on its way to the Senate.
That's great. That's great to hear. That's really good news. And I think that what's really interesting about what the point you're making is people need good housing and decent housing and housing that they can afford. But it's not just for the individual families, right? It's for our workforce and our communities. If you can't attract healthcare workers to a health clinic in Cuba, whether the people who already maybe have a house and are okay, they're suffering too, because they don't have the workforce that can serve their health needs. So these things are very interconnected. We know we have a big teacher shortage as well, and they're they don't get paid a lot of money, and they're struggling with housing costs. So I think I'm really glad to hear you make those connections, and I think this point about the voucher program too. This could be a voucher, a pilot that changes how we do homeownership programs in America, right? How do we help people who have not been able to buy a home? I think this could be we're going to learn from this, and hopefully the whole country's going to learn from it. So
yes,
go ahead.
Yes, and I really want to point out that the work that Homewise has done, because you have done programs where we've had money to help teachers with down payment assistance. You've had money to help nurses and people who work at our hospitals with down payment assistance. And those were programs where you were able to talk to the individual school districts, the hospital, to say, listen, you need to team up with us so that we can do this. But what we haven't had is where the federal government says, maybe we should look at something that's not just the mortgage tax deduction. Maybe we should look at how do we use those resources that we are putting, that we think are helping people acquire homes, but it might not be the most efficient and needed way. And that's why I'm so happy about this program that we are going to be financing through Homewise.
Yeah, no, it's really cool because you know what? I mean, there's sometimes that New Mexico leads the way for others, and this is an example of that, I think. So it's very cool. It's very much needed. Let me, like, one question I have. I know you're the chair of the Indigenous People Subcommittee in Congress, and I know that, you know, housing on Native American land and for Native Americans even living off of Pueblo land, are, you know, face unique housing challenges. Can you tell us more about what your thoughts about those kind of challenges that Native Americans are facing?
Yes, well, this issue about the lack of home ownership within Indian country has been something that's concerned me and that I've worked on for decades. When I was an attorney representing tribes, I participated in helping build home ownership programs because it's unique when you're on Indian land, whether it's a reservation or a pueblo. The land is actually held by the United States for the benefit of the tribe. So you don't really have fee simple title. But that doesn't mean you can't have home ownership. You just have to acknowledge that and work around it. And so I was really pleased that we were able to, in our latest bill, look at that issue. And I was co-lead of the bipartisan Native American Rural Homeownership Improvement Act. And this bill would expand and make permanent a USDA pilot program. So that pilot program is not in New Mexico, which likes to lead, but in South Dakota. And it's going to provide direct loans to Native American community development financial institutions, CDFIs, which Homewise is a CDFI. So we're going to provide those direct loans to increase homeownership opportunities for tribal communities in rural areas. And so we know that this is successful when people can actually have direct access to loans. We have the 184 program, but it's complicated and you got to get banks willing to participate. And so this one is saying, well, what if we actually do direct lending? And so we're going to hopefully scale that up and hopefully see it adopted in many of our Pueblo or Jicarilla or Apache or Navajo Nation, Mescalero Apache communities there in New Mexico.
Yeah, that's really good news. It's really good to hear that. Thank you so much for all your hard work. You've had you're relatively new to Congress, and it sounds like you're kicking it. So really appreciate it. And you know, I know you've always been a hard worker, and you know, you're tenacious, and you see things through to the finish line. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today, and we really appreciate you joining us. And this will end our discussion today, but please, you know, if you have feedback on this, please let us know. And thank you again, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Muchísimas gracias, Mike. Thank you.